So friends, our second lesson is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. And I think what Jesus is doing here is trying to put into context all of the law and the prophets, all of the expectations in the Hebrew Bible. Barb has just read, the 10 commandments, the 10 of them. And, it's interesting, even people who try and follow these commandments come up with very different ideas about how to do that. So, for instance, thou shalt not kill for some people means no killing at all. For others, it means, well, you can kill animals, you can kill people in war, you can kill people if they've committed heinous crimes, but you just can't kill an innocent person. So that commandment alone is not enough to guide us. And so Jesus here basically says, all of these laws really boil down to a twofold commandment. You love God with all your being, and you love your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you're doing that, presumably you're okay. So I invite you to listen to this gospel of Jesus Christ. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and all the prophets. Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So when I was growing up in the church, I was taught that the 10 commandments were about making God happy. All about what God wanted you to do. So obey the commandments. God will be pleased with you and reward you in this life and in the next. Break the commandments, and God will be angry with you and punish you in this life and the next. So here's a common joke from back then. So Moses comes down from the mountain with the tablets and says to the people, I've got some good news and some bad news. So the good news is I talked him down from 20 to 10. The bad news is adultery is still in there. And so in that view of the law of the commandments, they are to control us. They are a burden that we have to bear to get through this life. They're there to keep us from our desires. So this is interesting to me. So Buddhism has a similar set of commandments, but they have nothing to do with pleasing God, because in Buddhism there's no deity. So these commandments are 5 precepts. They're ancient like the 10 commandments. They're 2,500 years old, and there are only 5 of them, and here they are. So one is to refrain from taking life. Thou shalt not kill. To refrain from taking what is not given to you. Thou shalt not steal. To refrain from sexual misconduct. Don't commit adultery. To refrain from false speech. Don't bear false witness. Now the last one is unique. To refrain from consuming intoxicants. And in this tradition, consuming intoxicants can mean drugs and alcohol, but can mean anything else that sort of clouds your mind or enters your spirit that would cause suffering in the world. So anyway, if these rules are not about pleasing God, then what are they for? So in Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition, these 5 precepts are expanded upon, and each of them is introduced with these words: aware of the suffering caused by. So they're not to please God, but to avoid suffering, both suffering for ourselves and suffering for others. In other words, they are to ensure our well-being. So, for instance, thou shalt not steal becomes this: aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I am committed to practicing generosity in my thinking and speaking and acting. So I'm not suggesting we rewrite the Bible or rewrite the Ten Commandments, but that preface may help us see the Ten Commandments and all of the law in a new light. So, thou shalt not commit adultery becomes something like aware of the suffering caused by infidelity. I'm committed to control my desire and to be faithful in all of my relationships. And even the commandment of honoring the Sabbath begins to make more sense. So something like this: aware of the suffering caused by working myself or others 7 days a week, I am determined to provide rest for myself, my family, and my employees. So in this light, all of the commandments are really about being in right relationship with other people so that we might finally live in peace. And Jesus seemed to understand this about the law, the prophets, and all of the rules in the Hebrew Bible when he boils them all down to two commandments of loving God and neighbor. So Jesus says this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. He's saying all of Scripture is only understood through this lens of loving God with your whole being and loving your neighbor. So it really is about being in right relationship with other people. So Jesus, I don't want to disappoint you, but Jesus did not make this up. So he's quoting the Hebrew Bible. He's quoting a passage from Leviticus and Deuteronomy that he puts together when he says to love God and to love your neighbor. So he didn't make it up, and he's not the only teacher of his time to suggest that this is what it all boils down to. So St. Paul said in his letter to the Galatians, "For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So Paul even drops off the part about loving God. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It all boils down to that. In 1 John it says this: those who say I love God and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. You can't be any clearer than that, right? And a rabbi who was a contemporary of Jesus, Rabbi Hillel, once had someone come to him and say, "I will convert to Judaism if you can teach me the whole Torah while you just stand on one foot." And he says, "Oh, that's easy. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn." So this kind of consistent message that your love for God goes hand in hand with your love for others. They cannot be separated. And this would make you think that religious people would be the most loving people on earth, right? But alas, that is not how it plays out. So I shared this with you last spring. The Christian university that I attended, and Jan also attended, our alma mater, made national news last year when the board of directors doubled down on a policy that prohibits the hiring of LGBTQ plus people. From the president to the custodian, a ban on hiring any gay person. So Seattle Pacific is obviously a Christian college. They're affiliated with the Free Methodist Church, and being a Christian institution, they have the right, religious freedom, to hire or fire whoever they want. And I actually even get, given their tradition, why they wouldn't want to hire LGBTQ faculty in some areas, like in religion and Bible. But groundskeepers and administrative assistants and people who work in the cafeteria. So if you as an institution want to deny people employment because you don't agree with who they are, would you deny them the other things they need for life? Food and housing and medical care? And so the truth is, I think, both when I was there and apparently now, these Christians just could not stand to be around gay people at all. They just didn't want to be in their presence. So this summer, the school made news again by banning the public display of anything contrary to the school's values. And so this was widely seen as pushing back against the support for LGBTQ people that grew out of this first ban, right? And so people were putting pride flags in their dorm windows, faculty were putting similar things on the outside of their door, and the school said, you cannot do that anymore. The policy even, I just was so interested in this, included a ban on what you would put in your email signature. And so presumably this is because people would maybe put their preferred pronouns after their signature, which is becoming more and more common. And the school was even going to stop you from doing that. So how do you get from loving your neighbor as yourself to that? And I think part of the answer is that you push people to the margins where you don't see them, you don't know them, and you don't have to know them. If you don't see or know someone, it's kind of hard to love them. Apparently Abraham Lincoln said this. This is very wise and very Christ-like. Abraham Lincoln said this: I don't like that man. I must try to get to know him better. I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. Like a very Christ-like attitude. You don't run from difference. You embrace it. So notice here in Jesus' teaching, he does not say that we should love the whole world. Like we hear that elsewhere, but here he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that we should love our enemies. Again, he says that elsewhere, but he doesn't say that here. He even does not say that we should love our neighbors, plural. He says we should love our neighbor, singular, as we love ourselves. So I think what's happening here is he's calling us to the very particular practice of loving an actual person, our neighbor. So I think it's easy to sort of say, well, I love everyone, I love the whole world. But you don't really love someone until you get to know them. And sometimes when you get to know them, it's harder to love them. So it's a hard practice, right? So when he says love your neighbor, who's our neighbor, I guess is the next question. And if you take a look at the Greek word translated neighbor, its root simply means near. So it's not necessarily about people. The same word can be used to describe just any two objects that are in proximity to one another. So it literally means love the one who is near you. Love the one who is near you as you love yourself. Not people like you, not only people in your family, but anyone who comes into your circle. Love that person. And I think there's something really compelling about this idea of nearness, because as I said, until you actually are near someone, you can't really know them. And if you don't know them, if you don't know their story, you don't know the challenges they face, you don't know their heartaches, it's really easy to ignore them, to despise them, to hate them, to discriminate against them. So just think about how our nation these days is viewing immigrants, migrants, people coming here for refuge. So, I mean, this was happening during the Trump administration, a real pushback against people trying to get into this country. It's continuing under the Biden administration. Both administrations basically saying, do not come into our country, to really desperate people. And I shared a story last week about a community in New York that were saying, we don't want immigrants. Someone shared with me another story, exact same thing happening in Chicago. We don't want this community building turned into a place of shelter. So really hard-hearted behavior toward desperate people just trying to have a life. I really really do believe in the human spirit that if you actually met one of those people face to face with their hungry children, desperate for a place to be, your heart would soften and you would not say there's no room for you here. I really believe that when people come close, we do have the capacity to love them. So over the 30 or so years I've been a pastor, people have come to the churches I've served asking for help in all kinds of ways. And these days, the requests come by phone calls, by voicemail, by email, sometimes even by text messages. And, sometimes people actually come and knock on the door to the church, or if they somehow get in the building, they knock on my office door. And the truth is, when someone comes in person, it's much harder to dismiss them. It's easy to ignore an email or a voicemail and not call someone back or email them back. It's easy to have someone on the phone and say, I just don't have time to talk to you. But when they come near, they become your neighbor. When you hear their story, you see their humanity, and you're more likely to be moved to compassion. So it's easy to ignore an email. It's much harder to ignore someone right in front of you. So Jesus calls us to love the ones near us. And I have to admit that love does not seem to be highly valued in our country these days, or really in the world. At least love in the public square. I think we're pretty good about loving our friends, maybe loving the neighbors right next to us, loving our family. But loving people we disagree with, that's not in vogue at all anymore. So just think nationally how our elected representatives just despise each other. I mean, look what's happening in Washington right now. There's no mood that we should get to know one another and love one another. They are enemies to be defeated. As I said, just see how we're taught to fear migrants and refugees. Look at how our state and so many other states despise trans people and have zero compassion for trans children and their families. And notice this, how so much of the anti-trans legislation, from bathrooms to book bans, are designed to kind of push trans people into the shadows, into the margins, and out of sight. Again, when someone's out of sight, it's much easier to hate them. So our nation's instinct, it seems to be to fear people, which seems to be the instinct of all nations, to turn to kind of hatred and violence and war when they can't get along with their neighbors. And this horror that broke out in Israel this weekend, I think is just one more example of that. People doing horrible things to each other in the name of religion and nation. So love is not highly valued, I think, these days. And in the face of so much fear and distress and hatred, it really can seem impossible, this twofold commandment. But what I like about what Jesus teaches here is that he offers us a pretty simple place to start. Love your neighbor. Love the one near you. For now, you don't have to worry about loving the whole world. You don't have to worry about loving everyone in the political party you disagree with. For now, you just love the person in front of you. Just love whoever comes into your orbit this week. That's it. Just love that one person. And that we can do, or we can at least endeavor to do. It's a place to start. And as we take up that practice, we might say this: aware of the suffering caused by anger and hatred and suspicion and violence, I am determined to love everyone I meet this day. Aware of the suffering, I am determined to love everyone I meet this day. The truth is this: every time every time we choose love over hate, a little more light comes into the world. A little more light. And with that light, we are building God's kingdom of peace, joy, and love. Thanks be to God. Amen.